The Billionaire's Reckless Bet. Edward Sinclair had everything, or at least, that's what the world believed. At just 36 years old, he was the CEO of Sinclair Innovations, a tech empire that had revolutionized artificial intelligence. His name frequently graced the covers of business magazines, and his wealth made him one of the most powerful men in the world. Yet, despite the private jets, sprawling mansions, and limitless luxury, Edward felt a growing emptiness gnawing at him. Wealth came with expectations. He had spent years cultivating an image of success, one that left no room for vulnerability. Relationships in his world were transactions, built on power and convenience rather than genuine connection. He had dated supermodels, socialites, and heiresses, but they had all blended into the same shallow routine. Nothing excited him anymore. It was on one such night, filled with the usual monotony, that he found himself at an exclusive lounge in downtown Manhattan, sipping a glass of Macallan whiskey, surrounded by the same group of ultra-rich friends he had known for years. Julian Carter, a venture capitalist with a love for high-stakes bets, leaned in with his usual mischievous grin. "Edward, tell me something," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Edward smirked, already accustomed to Julian's dramatic antics. "Go on. You've conquered everything. Built an empire. Made billions. Had every woman you could want." Julian paused for effect. "But I bet you couldn't last 3 months married to a woman who isn't from our world." Laughter erupted around the table. Edward raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Julian's grin widened. "I mean someone real. Not a model, not an heiress, not a woman who cares about status. Someone completely out of your league, our league." Edward rolled his eyes. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Julian challenged, drumming his fingers on the table. "You live in a bubble, Sinclair. The real world? You wouldn't last a day in it." Edward leaned back, a hint of curiosity creeping into his expression. "And if I prove you wrong?" Julian smirked. "Then I'll invest 50 million into any project of your choosing. No questions asked." The stakes were high, but for Edward, money was never the issue. It was the challenge that intrigued him. Julian pointed out the window, toward a McDonald's across the street. "See that fast food joint? That's where you'll find her. Walk in, pick a girl, whoever's working the counter, and marry her. 3 months, Edward. Then we'll see how much of a king you really are." Edward glanced at the bustling McDonald's. It was an absurd proposition. He had spent his entire life in high-end restaurants, luxury hotels, and private clubs. Fast food was a foreign concept to him. Yet, something about the bet intrigued him. It wasn't about the money. It was the idea of doing something reckless, something completely outside the carefully curated world he had built. Without another word, he stood, buttoned his designer blazer, and crossed the street. Inside the Golden Arches. The scent of frying oil and grilled beef hit him immediately as he stepped into the brightly lit McDonald's. It was a Friday night, and the place was packed with families, teenagers, and blue-collar workers grabbing a quick meal. Edward's presence was out of place. His tailored suit and polished leather shoes stood in stark contrast to the casual crowd around him. People threw him curious glances, but he ignored them. His eyes scanned the room before settling on the young woman working behind the counter. She was striking, not in an obvious, high-fashion way, but in a way that commanded attention. Her dark brown skin glowed under the fluorescent lights, and her natural curls were pulled back into a loose ponytail. There was a quiet dignity in the way she moved, her posture straight despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes. She wasn't just another fast food worker. She was something more. Edward stepped forward. "Excuse me." She looked up, her warm brown eyes meeting his. "Welcome to McDonald's. What can I get for you?" Edward studied her name tag. "Amara." I'd like a conversation. Amara blinked, clearly thrown off. We don't sell that here. A smirk tugged at the corner of Edward's lips. He wasn't used to being dismissed so easily. Then how about I buy whatever meal will give me 5 minutes of your time? Amara gave him a long, scrutinizing look before exhaling. Sir, there's a line behind you. Edward glanced over his shoulder. A few impatient customers shifted in place, waiting for their orders. He turned back to her, unfazed. Then I'll take whatever meal takes the longest to prepare. Amara sighed, punching in an order. 1 well-done quarter-pounder with extra toppings. That'll be $6.49. Edward pulled out a black Amex card. Amara snorted. We don't take Amex. For the first time in years, Edward Sinclair was caught off guard. He wasn't even sure if he had cash on him. A snicker from the kitchen staff made Amara bite her lip to hide a smile. You're telling me a billionaire doesn't have a visa? Edward smirked. You know who I am? Your face is all over the business news. She handed him a receipt. Now step aside, Mr. CEO. Other people are hungry. Edward had never been dismissed like that before. And strangely, he liked it. The offer. Edward didn't leave. Instead, he waited until Amara's shift ended. As she walked out, she found him leaning against his car, a sleek, black Bentley. She rolled her eyes. You again? He grinned. You're interesting. Amara snorted. You must be bored out of your mind if you think a McDonald's worker is interesting. Edward's expression turned serious. I have a proposition for you. Amara arched an eyebrow. Let me guess, you want me to be your assistant? Personal chef? Oh, I know, a charity case? No, Edward said smoothly. I want you to marry me. Silence. Amara burst out laughing. That's the worst pickup line I've ever heard. I'm serious. Her laughter faded. Why? Edward hesitated before smirking. Call it an experiment. I want to see if two people from completely different worlds can make it work. Amara crossed her arms. And what's in it for me? Everything, he said simply. Financial security. A better life. A fresh start. She studied him, her sharp gaze searching for cracks in his facade. You're not serious, she murmured. Edward leaned in slightly. Say yes, and you'll never have to work another shift at McDonald's again. Amara exhaled, shaking her head. And if I say no? Edward smirked. Then I'll keep coming back until you change your mind. For a moment, Amara just stared at him. Then, with a small, amused smile, she said, Good luck with that, rich boy. And with that, she walked away, leaving Edward Sinclair, Billionaire CEO, standing alone for the first time in his life, completely intrigued. The reluctant agreement. Edward Sinclair wasn't used to waiting. He wasn't used to rejection either. Yet, here he was, standing outside a modest McDonald's, watching as Amara Carter walked away without so much as a backward glance. He should have felt embarrassed, even insulted. Instead, he felt something else, determination. Most women threw themselves at him. They giggled at his jokes, leaned in too close, and hung on every word he spoke. But Amara? She had dismissed him with nothing more than a smirk and a few sarcastic comments. And that made her the most intriguing woman he had ever met. Edward pulled out his phone, dialing a number. Julian, he said as soon as his friend picked up. The bet is on. There was a pause, then a laugh. You're serious? You're actually going through with this? Edward's eyes stayed locked on Amara's retreating figure. I don't lose. Julian chuckled. All right, Sinclair. Let's see how long you last. Edward ended the call and slipped into his Bentley. He had a plan to put in motion. Amara's world. Amara didn't want to be interesting to a billionaire. She had no desire to be someone's experiment. As she walked home, her sneakers scuffing the pavement, she rolled her eyes at the ridiculousness of it all. Marry him? A billionaire? Just like that? She wasn't a charity case. She didn't need saving. Her life wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She worked at McDonald's because it paid the bills while she worked toward her real dream, finishing her degree in psychology. And she wasn't about to throw all that away for a man who was used to buying whatever he wanted. By the time she reached her apartment, a tiny studio with peeling paint and a faucet that dripped no matter how many times she fixed it, she had convinced herself she wouldn't see Edward Sinclair again. She was wrong. The billionaire's persistence. The next morning, he was waiting outside McDonald's. She spotted him the moment she walked in, standing by the window with a coffee in hand, wearing another one of his ridiculously expensive suits. Amara sighed, tightening her ponytail. He can't be serious. When she approached the counter, he stepped forward. Good morning, Edward said smoothly. Morning, Amara replied, unamused. You here for another well-done burger? No, he said, eyes locked onto hers. I'm here for you. A couple of her coworkers overheard and giggled. Amara exhaled sharply. Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not interested. Edward leaned on the counter, completely unfazed. It's not a game. Then what is it? She challenged, crossing her arms. He studied her, then finally said, it's a proposal. Amara scoffed. Oh, so you're doubling down on the crazy? Edward smirked. Not crazy. Just determined. Her shift was about to start, so she didn't have time for his nonsense. Look, she said, exasperated, even if I wanted to entertain this ridiculous idea, I don't know you. Then get to know me. Amara blinked. He wasn't backing down. Give me one dinner, he said, sliding a business card across the counter. If you hate it, I'll never bother you again. Amara stared at the card. Sinclair Innovations. CEO and founder. Her fingers hovered over it before she scoffed. I'm not impressed by money. Edward grinned. Good. I'm not impressed by people who are. Before she could argue, he stepped back and walked out, leaving the business card untouched on the counter. The unlikely date. Amara wasn't going to go. That was her plan. She wasn't the type to get swept away by charm, and she definitely wasn't the type to let a rich man's boredom dictate her choices. And yet, by the time her shift ended, she found herself staring at that business card, running her thumb over the embossed letters. What's the worst that could happen? She could get a free meal. Maybe he'd get bored and move on. Just one dinner. The dinner that changed everything. Amara expected the most pretentious restaurant possible, something Michelin-starred where the waiters spoke in hushed tones and the menu didn't even list prices. But instead, Edward took her to a small, family-owned Italian restaurant tucked away in a quiet part of the city. Seriously? Amara raised an eyebrow. A billionaire who doesn't do five-star dining? Edward smirked as he pulled out her chair. I like surprises. She sat down, skeptical. So, what's your endgame here, Mr. Sinclair? He leaned forward. I already told you. Marriage. Amara laughed. You say that like it's a business deal. Maybe it is, Edward said, watching her carefully. Her laughter faded. You're serious? Completely. She shook her head, stunned. Why? Edward hesitated. For the first time that night, he looked uncertain. Because I want to see if I can do something real, he admitted. I've spent my life building an empire. Making money. But none of it means anything if I don't even know what it's like to connect with someone outside of that world. Amara studied him, searching for a hidden agenda. You really think you can buy authenticity? No, Edward said. But I think I can earn it. The way he said it, so calm, so certain, made her stomach flip. Amara leaned back. And what happens after 3 months? You get bored? Edward's jaw tightened. I don't get bored easily. The way his eyes held hers made her pulse race, and she hated that. She should have walked away. She should have laughed in his face. But instead, she found herself curious. What if? What if this was an opportunity? Not for money. Not for luxury. But for something else. Something undeniably real. She tapped her fingers against the table. One last chance to say no. Instead, she exhaled and said, fine. But on one condition. Edward raised an eyebrow. Name it. Amara met his gaze. No lies. No games. If we do this, we do it my way. A slow smile spread across his face. Deal. But Amara had a secret too. As Edward reached for his drink, Amara's smile wavered. Because he wasn't the only one keeping secrets. And if he found out the truth, this whole experiment might just destroy him. The wedding that wasn't meant to be. Amara Carter sat on the edge of her worn-out sofa, staring at the wedding contract Edward had sent over. She had agreed to this insane proposal, but seeing it in black and white made it all too real. The contract outlined everything. The 3-month timeline. No public scandals. A hefty payout at the end. And, surprisingly, no intimacy unless mutually agreed upon. That last part puzzled her. Wasn't this supposed to be some twisted billionaire game? Why would a man like Edward Sinclair draw that boundary? She wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse. Her phone buzzed. Edward Sinclair. Tomorrow. Noon. Be ready. No, good morning, no, hope you're well. Just pure, straight to the point dominance. Amara rolled her eyes. If she was going to go through with this, he needed to learn that she wasn't one of his corporate minions. She typed back. I have a shift. Can't. The response came in seconds. Edward. You don't anymore. Amara's heart stopped. She jumped up, dialing her manager. Marcy, tell me you didn't. Marcy sighed. Your new husband paid off your contract. And threw in an extra $5,000. I would have fired myself for that. Amara clenched her jaw. That arrogant. Marcy lowered her voice. Amara, are you sure about this? A man like that, marrying you out of nowhere? It's not normal. No. It wasn't. But neither was her secret. And that secret was the reason she couldn't just walk away. A wedding without love. The wedding was held at an exclusive estate, far from the paparazzi and prying eyes of the world. Amara stood in front of a full-length mirror, her fingers brushing against the pearls lining her wedding dress. It was a designer gown worth more than her entire apartment building. A part of her wanted to rip it off. Another part, one she refused to acknowledge, couldn't ignore the fact that she had never felt more beautiful. A knock at the door. Edward's assistant, Julian, stepped in. Ready? Amara turned to face him. This is crazy. Julian smirked. Oh, definitely. She exhaled. What's he like when he's not playing Billionaire? Julian hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. Edward doesn't do things without reason. If he chose you, then you're more important than you think. His words sent a chill down her spine. The ceremony. There were no guests. No family. No friends. Just Edward and Amara, standing under an archway of white roses, with an officiant who was probably paid more than a doctor's salary just to say a few words. Edward stood tall in an impeccably tailored black suit, his blue eyes holding a gaze that made her feel exposed, like he could see into her soul. "This is the part where you run," he murmured as she reached him. Amara lifted her chin. "And let you win the bet?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I'd rather lose." She arched a brow. "Liar." The officiant cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" The vows they didn't mean. "Do you, Edward Sinclair, take this woman, Amara Carter, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Edward's jaw tightened. His fingers twitched at his side. And for the first time, Amara saw something other than confidence in his expression. Hesitation. Just for a second. But then, it was gone, and he said the words with practiced ease. "I do." The officiant turned to Amara. "And do you, Amara Carter, take Edward Sinclair?" Amara almost laughed. This wasn't real. She wasn't a bride. She was a pawn in a game she barely understood. But then she caught sight of the contract folded in the officiant's book, a legally binding document that could change her life forever. And she remembered why she was doing this. For herself. For her future. For her secret. "I do," she whispered. And just like that, it was done. The kiss that wasn't supposed to happen. It was supposed to be a fake kiss. A peck on the cheek, a meaningless gesture for the sake of formality. But when Edward leaned in, his hand brushed against her bare shoulder, sending an unexpected spark through her body. She held her breath. And instead of a chaste kiss, he did something else. He cupped her face, tilting her chin up slowly, as if giving her time to pull away. But she didn't. And then his lips were on hers. It wasn't rough. It wasn't forced. It was soft. Measured. As if he was discovering something unexpected. And for a second, just a second, Amara forgot everything. Forgot that this was a bet. Forgot that this wasn't real. Forgot her secret. And that was dangerous. Because Edward Sinclair might have wealth, power, and arrogance. But Amara had something far more dangerous. The ability to make him feel something real. The wedding night. Back at Edward's penthouse, the tension was suffocating. Amara stepped into the massive suite, larger than any place she had ever lived in. Edward removed his jacket, loosening his tie. "The bedroom is down the hall." Subtle. He exhaled. "I meant that you can take whichever one you want." Amara raised an eyebrow. "So, what now? We just pretend to be married in public and live separate lives?" Edward turned to her, something unreadable in his expression. "That was the agreement, wasn't it?" Amara folded her arms. "Right. Of course." But something about the way he said it, like he wasn't sure anymore, made her pulse quicken. She wasn't sure anymore either. And that was a problem. Because if he found out the truth about her, this whole arrangement would come crashing down. Edward thought he was in control. But he had no idea. Amara was hiding something big. And once he found out, he might never forgive her. The secrets we keep. Amara stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of Edward's penthouse suite, watching the skyline glitter under the night sky. Her reflection stared back at her, a bride in name only. Somewhere behind her, Edward was on a call, pacing the room with the same cold authority he carried everywhere. She had spent years keeping people at a distance, building walls no one could climb. Yet somehow, in less than 24 hours, she was standing in a billionaire's penthouse, wearing his ring, playing his wife, and holding on to a secret that could destroy them both. She exhaled, watching the glass fog up beneath her breath. This wasn't about love. It was about control. And the funny thing was, neither of them truly had it. The rules of their marriage. Edward hung up the phone and turned to face her. We need to set some ground rules. Amara crossed her arms, unimpressed. Oh, this should be good. Edward didn't react to her sarcasm. Rule 1, no talking to the press. She rolled her eyes. I wasn't planning on it. Rule 2, in public, we act like a real couple. That means affection, hand-holding, and whatever else convinces people this is real. Her pulse quickened at that, but she refused to show it. You do realize I'm not an actress, right? Edward smirked. You fooled me well enough. Amara gritted her teeth. He was insufferable. Rule 3, he continued, stepping closer, his presence commanding the space. You don't interfere in my business, and I don't interfere in yours. At that, Amara's expression faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Because if Edward dug into her past, if he found out the truth, she couldn't let that happen. She nodded stiffly. Fine. Edward studied her, eyes narrowing slightly. Anything you want to add? She hesitated, then lifted her chin. Yes. One rule. Edward arched a brow. No falling in love. A flicker of something crossed his face, amusement? Curiosity? Something else? Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Trust me, sweetheart, he said smoothly. That won't be a problem. A billionaire's world. The next morning, Amara woke up to Julian, Edward's assistant, knocking on her door. Mrs. Sinclair, he greeted, voice polite but firm. Amara blinked. It took her a second to remember, oh. Right. She was married now. Edward wants you ready in an hour, Julian continued. You'll be meeting his family today. Amara froze. His family? Why? She asked. Julian smiled faintly. His mother insisted. Of course. The one person more powerful than a billionaire CEO? His mother. Meeting the Sinclairs. The Sinclair estate was the kind of place that didn't belong in reality. A massive mansion, built like a castle, surrounded by pristine gardens and lined with imported marble statues. The moment Amara stepped inside, she felt the weight of wealth pressing down on her. And at the head of it all stood Eleanor Sinclair, Edward's mother. She was a woman who had perfected the art of looking both regal and ruthless, dressed in an ivory suit that screamed power. Edward, she greeted her son with a polite nod. Then her gaze shifted to Amara. She took her in, eyes sweeping from Amara's simple dress to her natural curls, to the wedding ring Edward had placed on her finger. You must be Amara. Amara met her stare evenly. I am. A pause. Then Eleanor smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. How lovely. Dinner with lions. Dinner was an exercise in survival. Seated at a long, ridiculously extravagant dining table, Amara quickly realized that the Sinclairs didn't just eat dinner. They interrogated their guests. Tell us about yourself, Amara, Eleanor said, sipping from her wine glass. Where did you grow up? New Orleans, Amara answered smoothly. And your family? She hesitated, only for a second. My parents passed away when I was young. A flicker of something, was it pity? No. Eleanor Sinclair didn't do pity. How tragic, Eleanor murmured, though she sounded far more interested than sympathetic. Across the table, Edward was watching. Silent. Calculating. He knew his mother. He knew she was digging. And Amara knew that too. She just had to make sure Eleanor Sinclair didn't find what she was looking for. Edward's warning. By the time they returned to the penthouse, Amara was exhausted. Edward loosened his tie, watching her carefully. You handled that well, he said. Amara shrugged. I've been handling people like your mother my whole life. Edward smirked. People like my mother? You know what I mean. Edward didn't deny it. Instead, he walked over to the bar, pouring himself a drink. She doesn't trust you, he said after a moment. Amara leaned against the counter. And you do? Edward looked at her, his blue eyes sharp. I don't trust anyone. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Amara said, Good. Edward narrowed his eyes. Why? Amara smiled slightly. Because it means you won't be looking too closely at me. Edward studied her. Too closely. And for the first time since this game began, Amara wondered. Was she playing him? Or was she about to lose herself in this game, too? The storm brewing. Days passed. And something was changing between them. In public, they were the perfect power couple, a billionaire and his beautiful, confident wife. But behind closed doors, the lines between fake and real were starting to blur. There were moments. Small, quiet moments. Like the time Edward caught her dancing barefoot in the kitchen, humming a song she thought no one else could hear. Or the time he defended her at a charity gala when a senator's wife made a comment about Amara's background. You underestimate my wife, Edward had said, his voice dangerously soft. And later that night, he had murmured, You don't need me to protect you, do you? No, Amara had whispered. And yet, some part of her had felt safe. Which was a problem. Because safety was an illusion. And the closer she got to Edward Sinclair, the harder it would be to keep her secret hidden. The past catches up. One night, as Edward was working late, Amara received a message. A private number. She opened it, and her heart stopped. We need to talk. You can't hide forever. The past she had buried was coming for her. And if Edward found out, everything would fall apart. The past unleashed. Amara's hands trembled as she stared at the message. We need to talk. You can't hide forever. The words burned into her mind. She quickly deleted the message, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Her past, the one she had spent years outrunning, had found her. And if Edward found out, everything would fall apart. She turned off her phone and pressed her palms to her face, trying to calm her racing heart. No. Not here. Not now. She had come too far. She had played her role too well to let this unravel everything. But the truth was like smoke. No matter how tightly you tried to hold it, it always found a way to escape. A suspicious husband. Edward entered the penthouse an hour later, his sharp blue eyes scanning the dimly lit room. He found Amara standing by the window, her arms crossed. Something was off. He had spent years in boardrooms, negotiating billion-dollar deals, reading people like open books. And right now, Amara was hiding something. He leaned against the doorway, studying her. Something on your mind? She turned, masking her emotions with a casual smile. Should there be? Edward arched a brow. You tell me. Amara exhaled and walked past him toward the bar. It's been a long day. That's all. Edward wasn't convinced. But he let it go. For now. Because Amara wasn't just his wife on paper. She was a mystery. And Edward Sinclair hated mysteries. A late-night visitor. At 2 a.m., Amara woke to the sound of her phone vibrating. She grabbed it quickly, her heart pounding. Private number. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. But deep down, she knew, this wouldn't stop until she faced it. She slipped out of bed and stepped onto the balcony, the cold air biting her skin. Then, she answered. Hello, she whispered. A deep voice came through the line. You didn't think you could disappear, did you? Her breath hitched. You don't belong in that world, Amara. No matter how much you try to pretend. Her grip tightened on the phone. What do you want? She asked, keeping her voice steady. The caller chuckled. Oh, sweetheart. It's not about what I want. It's about what he will do when he finds out the truth. A shiver ran down her spine. Meet me tomorrow. Same place as before. Before she could respond, the line went dead. She stood frozen, the weight of her past crashing down on her. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, everything could come undone. And Edward Sinclair would never forgive her. Secrets in the dark. Unbeknownst to Amara, Edward had woken up. He stood inside, just beyond the glass doors, watching her. She was gripping her phone so tightly, her knuckles had turned white. And when she finally turned back toward the room, her face was pale, her expression unreadable. Edward narrowed his eyes. What the hell was she hiding? The meeting. The next day, Amara arrived at a secluded cafe on the outskirts of the city. She slid into a corner booth, scanning the room. Then, a man sat across from her. Dark eyes. A familiar smirk. The ghost from her past. Hello, Amara. She clenched her jaw. Why now? The man leaned forward, his voice smooth as silk. Because you're playing a dangerous game. He placed a manila envelope on the table. And when he slid it toward her, her heart stopped. Inside were photos of her. Her old life. The one thing she had sworn never to let resurface. And at the very bottom, a photo of her standing next to a man. Not just any man. Edward's greatest enemy. She swallowed hard. What do you want? The man smirked. The same thing I've always wanted. He leaned closer, voice dark. To watch everything you built burn to the ground. Edward's discovery. That evening, Edward stood in his office, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. Julian, his assistant, placed a file in front of him. We ran a deeper background check on Mrs. Sinclair, Julian said quietly. And we found something. Edward opened the file. And froze. Staring back at him was a photo of Amara, with the last person Edward would ever expect. His expression darkened, his heart pounding in his chest. He had known Amara was hiding something. But this? This was betrayal. And Edward Sinclair didn't forgive betrayal. The unraveling. Edward Sinclair was not a man who tolerated betrayal. And as he sat in his office, staring at the photos of his wife standing beside his greatest enemy, his grip on the paper tightened. His heart pounded. His mind raced. Was this entire marriage a lie? Had she played him? Used him? Or was there something even deeper at play? One thing was certain, Amara had secrets. And Edward was about to rip them wide open. The confrontation. Amara arrived at the penthouse late that evening. The moment she stepped through the door, she knew something was wrong. The air felt thick. The silence was too loud. And then, Edward appeared. He stood in the middle of the living room, holding the file in one hand, a glass of whiskey in the other. His blue eyes were unreadable, his expression lethal. Where were you? He asked, his voice calm. Too calm. Amara hesitated. Out. Edward let out a low chuckle and tossed the file onto the coffee table. Try again. Her stomach dropped. Slowly, she stepped forward and looked down. The photos. Every single one. Laid out like evidence in a courtroom. She sucked in a breath. Edward, Who the hell are you? He interrupted, his voice sharper now. Amara's heart pounded. I'm your wife, she whispered. Edward's jaw clenched. You're a liar. A sharp silence filled the space between them. Then, he stepped closer, his piercing gaze locked onto hers. "Did you plan this?" he demanded. "Did you marry me because of him?" Amara shook her head. "No. I never. Don't lie to me." His voice was dangerous now, filled with the kind of fury that could destroy worlds. Amara swallowed hard. "Edward, please. Let me explain." He took a step back, running a hand through his hair. "I should have known," he muttered. "I should have known you were too perfect. Too good to be true." Her heart ached. Because this was the moment she had feared. The moment he would hate her. But she couldn't keep running. So she took a deep breath. And finally, told him the truth. The truth that changes everything. "I wasn't always Amara Sinclair," she said quietly. Edward's jaw tightened. "I was Amara Castillo," she continued. "And before I met you, I was engaged to Daniel Mercer." Edward went still. Daniel Mercer. His rival. His enemy. The man who had tried to ruin him. Amara continued, her voice steady but filled with pain. "I was young. Stupid. I thought I loved him." She hesitated. "But he wasn't who I thought he was." Edward folded his arms. "What does that mean?" She inhaled sharply. "It means he was dangerous. Controlling. Abusive. And when I finally found the courage to leave him, he made sure I had nothing." Edward's expression darkened. She looked down, as if remembering the pain. "I disappeared. Changed my name. Started over. And then. I met you." Edward said nothing. Because for the first time since this confrontation began, he didn't know what to think. Was she still lying? Or was this the truth? And why did it hurt so much to even doubt her? Edward's decision. Minutes passed. Then, Edward walked over to the bar and poured himself another drink. When he turned back to Amara, his eyes were colder. "You should have told me." She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I know." Edward studied her, as if trying to decide what to do next. Then he spoke. "You have two choices," he said. "You tell me everything, no more secrets. No more lies." He took a sip of his drink. "Or you leave. Tonight." Amara's breath caught. She looked into his eyes. And saw it, the war inside him. He still didn't trust her. But somewhere, deep down, he still wanted to. And so, with a deep breath, she made her choice. She told him everything. The enemy in the shadows. What neither of them knew was that Daniel Mercer was watching. A man like Daniel never let go. And now that he had found Amara again, he wasn't about to let her slip away. He smirked, dialing a number. "Plan B," he said smoothly. "It's time to remind her that she still belongs to me."